So without any further ado, we'd like to put a warm hand together to welcome Dr. David Baker.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and wow, what a lot of people came to hear this talk today, and welcome to what is a very impressive facility here. So thanks to all those who have organized this event, and for the lovely hosting that we have had since we arrived a couple of hours ago. Indeed, it's really good to see you folks all here. I guess it's been a topic that's been in the news prolifically in the last couple of 3 months, the 50th anniversary of the first landing on the moon. And I have been amazed at the number of people who have been stimulated to come to various talks and various meetings. I've done about 25 podcasts and TV things and radio things, and seen the extraordinary enthusiasm and jaw-dropping awe from those who were not alive at the time. And only, I think, 2 billion of the 7.5 billion on the planet today were actually alive when humans landed on the moon. How many of you were? Yeah, that's about the proportionality, isn't it? Yeah, oh, I should have put my hand up, shouldn't I? And what I want to do today is to take you on a bit of a journey through 2 presentations, and there will be scope and opportunity, and I'd welcome you to questions and answers after I've done the presentations here. But really, essentially, what this is to walk you through how we made this program happen, why we did it, and what was the fundamental reasons for its success. A lot of my activities in this program, which should bring up a change, and we don't seem to have that. I will continue to talk while Ed races to the console and plays Mr. Mission Control. And there we are. Well, that... yeah, I think I have that now, so there we are. We're in business. But it wasn't the first time we had to rewrite the script. Okay. Thank you very much, Ed. That's great. That's got a couple of interesting things in that picture. That's a proportionately scaled representation of the moon with respect to the Earth. It is little more, fractionally more than a quarter of the diameter of our home planet. But it is the biggest secondary body to a primary orbiting any planet in the solar system. And while we're embarrassingly outclassed by the scores and scores of moons at Jupiter and Saturn, nevertheless, this one that we have is a biplanetary system with Earth. That's how we think about it now. Because understanding how the moon evolved has been crucial to underpinning the story of the Earth's origin and its evolution. And there are few fields which touch more people today than concerns about our environmental issues. What is this planet? Why is it different from so many others? What is so wonderful about it? And I unashamedly say that although my particular work was in the technical and engineering aspects of Apollo, and in looking to expand and develop the spacecraft that got us there initially on the moon, that essentially what we wanted to do was to stay and understand it as a biplanetary product of an evolution that began 4.5 billion years ago. And the value of this is that the moon has frozen at the end of the first quarter of the Earth-Moon history, whereas life on Earth, the geomorphology of our planet, really we can trace back, except for special circumstances, no greater than the end of the first quarter of this Earth-Moon period. So it's too hard, it's a real curate's egg, the story of the Earth-Moon system, because we get a full spectrum history of that early period, totally erased now by sea and wind and water and weather, on our Earth, but not on the moon. And so geologically, geomorphologically, in terms of the way the surface is formed, and geophysically, petrologically, we can understand exactly what our moon system is about with the Earth. So that's why it was important. And the bottom picture that you see there That really was the extended operation of the missions, where we were able to produce a lunar roving vehicle. And my work, primarily after the Apollo 11 flight, was very much to develop the hardware, help train the astronauts to go and do very, very much more. And I have a few graphics as we move through this to explain exactly how that was accomplished. But we've much to show, and so basically, although we have the NASA badge up there, I think it's fairly obvious that I'm British, and that many of us from Canada, some of us from the UK, some from the UK actually have their signature on a little piece of the equipment that was left by the Apollo 11 astronauts on the moon. So, and a little sketch of the Union Jack is on the moon. And this was much to the amusement of the astronauts, who had a very international flavor. You know, the politics made the program what it was in terms of its origin, but in fact it was the science and the engineering that knitted people together from all over the world. And many of the experiments that were sent to the moon and stayed there to operate for 8, 9, 10 years after we came back from the last landings, continuously sending scientific data from the lunar surface, were manufactured and produced and sponsored and paid for by several countries around the world. So this internationalization of space that now we see with the big space station really began in these days when we finally nailed the political goal, unashamedly at the time, to beat the ideological confrontation from the former Soviet Union and to really create a sense that Kennedy wanted to demonstrate to the uncommitted countries of the world that Western cultures and Western democratic systems were superior to those in the East. Well, we've gone long past that now. And we've gone almost 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the metamorphosis of these programs into a very big international agenda now actually energizes the space program so that we are much more than the sum of our parts today. But it really all began here. Okay, so let me just run you through a series of key events which helps to frame exactly how Apollo came about. And of course, Sputnik, October the 4th, 1957, was a tremendous shock, caused panic across the United States, and certainly in Europe, a poll put out by the US government, actually it was secret at the time, it was through the embassies, polling opinion in various countries, showed that after this, Sputnik, every country except the United Kingdom in Europe, Europe and the UK at that time, there was no European Union, of course, but every other country except the UK felt that Russia was the technological leader and was pointing the way toward the future and not the United States. And this worried the American government with regard to its flagging influence around the world, and so led to a series of activities which really focused down around the formation of NASA. Congressional hearings were held, and pretty well a year after Sputnik, it's October the 1st because that was the beginning of the American financial year, so government bureaucracies like neat and tidy accounting lines, and so it occurred that NASA was formed out of the old National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which dates back right to the First World War, the sort of American equivalent of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. And so until 1958, NASA had been a bunch of scientists, think tank workers from engineering and science to help boost the American aviation industry. And so what better origin than to metamorphose it into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And the Russians continued with their spectacular successes. January 59, Luna 1 passed the moon. Luna 2, 9 months later, hit the moon. Luna 3, October, sends the first pictures of the far side. Remember, the moon has it's fixed in what we call synchronous rotation, so that the near side is continuously facing Earth, and 1 day on the moon is 1 month as it goes round, so it's continually facing. It's locked into synchronous rotation, and there are various physical laws which determine that. So we never saw what the far side was like. We now know it to be very, very different to the near side. But that's another aspect for another talk, for another day, at another place. But certainly this was quite a revealing coup that the Russians had. 1959 was the year of the Russian moon, as you can see. And President Kennedy took over as office of of the presidency in the White House on January the 20th, 1961. And lo and behold, where he had accused his predecessor, President Eisenhower, of sitting around playing golf while the Russians were surging in the lead, no sooner had he become president than he was also embarrassed nationally for the American people by the first man in space, which was Yuri Gagarin. And America had its little Mercury program, little one-man Mercury program. And the first American in space was on May the 5th, a little straight up, straight down, a ballistic flight, straight up, straight down, just a 15-minute run. So that was precursor. That gave Kennedy the confidence to announce on the 25th of May the decision to go to the moon. And I can tell you that was a big wow, because nobody knew how to do it. And that was the biggest challenge at the time. Kennedy spoke to several of the NASA scientists and engineers who had a lot of plans on the shelf for Apollo, which was to follow Mercury and to have been a research laboratory, essentially, for Earth orbit. Then to go around the moon maybe at the end of the 60s, early 70s, and then sometimes in the 70s to go and actually achieve a landing on the surface, but in a measured, systematic, paced program without any hurry-up from any political goals. And the deal itself, which had been signed on the 25th of May, envisaged a spacecraft very much like this. And this is the Apollo spacecraft as envisaged immediately before Kennedy made the decision to go. And that decision gave NASA a timeline. Timelines are very important. They're very good. They can be both crippling millstones, and at the same time, they can be exactly what you need to mobilize and focus effort. There was no space or time to fiddle around on the periphery, as the old National Aeronautics, the old NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which NASA matured out of. And I have to say, and this is very, very important for those who consider the whole concept of how you build big systems, is that one of the biggest problems is staying on track and staying focused, and not to allow the mission creep, as it will, of your task to go off on many, many exciting things that you feel would be really great to do, but which are not central to the task at hand. The old NACA mindset was to go off and investigate everything and anything because it might be useful in aeronautical development. NASA was not about that business. It was about fulfilling an objective from a political mandate orchestrated by the President of the United States. And so the plans were that eventually, sometime in the 1970s, perhaps no earlier than the end of the 70s, we would have a landing on the moon by this Apollo spacecraft with the crew section right at the top and the liftoff section from the moon there that you can see in what was known as the service module, and then down here, a great big landing stage. Well, of course, it wasn't anything like what we actually finally got, because at the time, nobody, of course, had any idea how on earth we could actually do this. And I think people are very, very surprised that there were so many different designs, so many concepts. It would take more than a year before NASA decided how it was going to do this. And the clock was ticking. There were only 9 years at most to get this done by the end of the decade. And it grew by osmosis, this enormous commitment and will. And everybody signed up to it. We've got to do this by the end of the decade. But how? And so with all of these candidates, there was a very, very focused skim down of all of the concepts that could be candidates for actually achieving that particular goal. There were 4 principal modes. I'm not going to spend too much on this because they're very, each one is fascinating in its own right. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was to take 2 spacecraft, go to the moon with 2, send 1 down, bring the top half of that up, and come back in the mothership. Well, as you know, that's the one we actually chose. But the other ones that we didn't choose were Earth Orbit Rendezvous, where we would put together in Earth orbit a monster rocket that would be able to land this biggie, this enormous, great 50-ton vehicle is what it was initially in the design phase there. So assemble it all in Earth orbit, close to Earth, so that you're never more than about half an hour from coming back in the event of a problem. Assemble this great big moonship and then send it direct to the moon, like this image you see, and bring back also. There was a Saturn C5 direct flight, which would go without having to assemble on smaller rockets all the way and come all the way back. There was a Nova rocket, bigger than the Saturn V, which appeared in various guises, either solid propellant or liquid propellant. Liquid propellant engines are much more efficient in terms of the energy you get per kilogram of fuel combusted. And lunar surface rendezvous even, that you'd have several missions that you'd pre-position and pre-deploy all of your consumables, your habitability structures, and all of the equipment you needed to come back before you sent the crew, so that you were already assured that you had working equipment there to return before the crew actually went to gain an initial landing. Well, the decision on the 11th of July, a year after the commitment from Kennedy, 25th of May 1961, was to go for lunar orbit rendezvous with a command and service module for 3 men and a lunar module with 2 men. The whole thing turned out that it would weigh about 45 metric tons, which was not far short of a direct flight mode, but this built in insurance in that you had backup systems if anything went wrong, right up to the point where you committed to a landing. So it had multiplexed safety and risk-averse inputs in the overall design of having 2 spacecraft. You back out of that risk averse by getting slightly more risky, because any time you add complexity to a machine, you're going to increase the probability of failure. And compounded failure, you usually do a risk analysis and risk assessment based on the accumulated percentage probability of failure for each part. So all the thousands of different elements within a space vehicle, you add all those together, divide by the total, and then you have a mean average failure point. And then you work out how long each one of those will take before they fail. That's known as mean time before failure, MTBF. And so the 2 of those make the decision. It's not about what looks good, or, oh, that looks all right, you know. And the old adage of old scarf carrying aeronauts from the barnstorming days, that if it looks right, it'll fly right. You know, you've got to do a little bit more of nuanced decision-making when it comes to space vehicles. So lunar orbit rendezvous was the one that was chosen. Econometric studies were conducted, and it turned out that this was 9 months faster than the direct method, 10% cheaper than Earth orbit rendezvous, and that it had fewer critical pathways. And these were crucial, because pilots are not suicide jockeys. They really have a very concerned interest in the rest of their lives, and have an inborn desire to continue toward those uncompleted objections for their life. So they don't want to fly suicide missions, and they're not the gung-ho types that maybe film depictions sometimes place them in. Marginalizing, going off a little bit, people often ask me, aren't astronauts ever afraid? And of course they are. But it's management. It's fear management. And the more you know about the thing that you're involved with, the more you can cope with the fear. And the example was given to me of a recruiting center where the board was sat there behind their desk, and applicants came in one at a time, and one guy came in not knowing what on earth had been said to the previous, because it's sworn to secrecy, even going out different doors. And they said to this man, right, are you ever afraid? Me, sir? No, sir. Close the door on the way out, because if you're never afraid, you don't know what you're doing, because it's scary stuff. But it's fear management, which is why we took test pilots, military pilots, who had already a proven track record that they knew what they were doing, would voluntarily go into dangerous situations, but nothing beyond the point that they couldn't handle the risk management of their own presence within the system. And the astronauts came to play a very, very important part in working through all the various complexities of the flights themselves. They played a very important part in designing the ergonomics of the spacecraft itself. They were masters of control and display, so they worked with the engineers and the design teams. So they played a very, very important part. Were totally, completely focused. So much so that they didn't know lots about the program that was going on laterally and outside their own sphere of influence. And it's really quite strange when I, even up to the present, when I talk to some astronauts, they look completely askance when you talk about certain things that were going on in the program. We didn't tell them certain things that were very risky that we knew, because we were in the very dangerous engineering world of what we called concurrency. And this was something that, in the haste of the Cold War, the aircraft manufacturing industry was wooed into by both the political leadership, the Air Force and the Defense Department for military projects, whereby you don't just have sequential development of the prototyping, research and development, work through all of the problems which a particular aircraft might have, and then you go into building and flying, refining from that, and then go into production. We were actually concurrently developing, and there were certain very, very, very terribly bad aircraft projects which should have shut the door on concurrency long before we got to using it in the space program. But essentially, we were completing the design even while prototypes were flying, which is why in Apollo we instituted the idea of a Block 1, Block 2. The Block 1 would be a basic get up into orbit, prove out the systems, come straight back down. Then there was the Block 2, which had docking equipment and could go all the way to the moon and back. But essentially exactly the same spacecraft. But so some halfway between sequential and concurrency, that was why we ran into problems with the Apollo fire, and that's why we ran into certain problems. For instance, we found out that that monstrous Saturn V, which is about the weight of a US Navy frigate, is the height of St. Paul's Cathedral, and can propel 100 tons to nearly 40,000 kilometers an hour. And that's a big engineering challenge, the Saturn V. We discovered that if one of those 5 engines at the base of the Saturn V went out and they had to abort, they would not have been able to have aborted in the dead man zone, as we call it, before getting into upper stage aborts, because there'd been a twang effect on the vehicle which would have broken the vehicle and severed the communication lines that would have enabled the crew to trigger an abort. Buzz Aldrin never knew this and didn't know this until, by chance, I was being filmed for a TV program along with him, and he was shocked because we didn't tell these guys. They were flying the Saturn V. No point telling them, nothing could be done. We just held our breath, literally, for about the first 40 seconds, because in that period, they never would have been able to launch off from their escape system to land safely while the rocket itself, the massive Saturn V, blew up. Fortunately, we didn't have one of those situations. But that's an example of the focusing and the sheer balance that you had, where you had to keep these guys really tunnel-visioned and at the same time learn in parallel and apply engineering solutions insofar as you could. Whole teams went out to try to find out, because we found out about this just after Apollo 10, actually, in the telemetry that came back, deciphering it, interpreting it, running models about it in the simulators, and oops, big problem. And there was no point in telling the crew, because there was nothing they could do. They had signed up to the fact that there were risks and dangers and that there were unknowns. So this is not just, it's a warts and all program. You get this wonderful, glorious vision on a lot of these documentaries and films you see, that it was just a walk in the park. And, how did we make it look so simple? Well, it wasn't. It was very, very difficult. And we came very, very close to losing crews very early on in the program. Single launch, one mission, that meant we could, with the existing hardware, we could use a lot of this stuff many, many times. It had a diversified contract base, which meant that you could fuel industry, employment as well, and it had flexible surface operations so that each mission could grow on the lessons from the past. So you didn't have a whole cohort of rockets and spacecraft having to get you there by that very hardware expensive route. And a legacy potential for diversified roles. We wanted to take all the Apollo equipment, the Saturn V, the Commander Service Module you see there, and the Lunar Module, and do other different things with them. There were whole plans to turn the Lunar Module into little mini astronomical observatories. There was even a terrible, and I'm trying to give you a warts and all, and things you will furrow your brow at. The Air Force wanted to buy lunar modules to turn them into killer satellites. And there were even designs, and I published the designs in one of the books I've written, which show that, of course, it never happened, it never got that far. But such was the potential application of each of these vehicles. Where humans are involved, they will always try to turn these wondrous engineering devices into weapons of war, into instruments of conflict, and we have that within our conscious state as human beings that we tend to do this. But this was right outside the context of NASA and what it was doing. So you can see there, because I have to emphasize that NASA is a civilian space agency, and that it does not develop, nor does it play any part in the development of any military space operations. That's not a PR soundbite. That is really seriously genuine. I was farmed off to do various things with the US Air Force, and it was a whole different world and right outside, and could not talk about those things when I went back in with NASA. So there was a lot of that stuff going on at the time. That's just to show you the assemblage, a little bit of overkill on the graphics, as to what we avoided by having to go, or by going to the better one. Now, Apollo-related events, back to this. We had major changes 2.5 years after the decision to go. NASA was going nowhere with this. The guys didn't know which end was up, and what I mean by that is that the old NACA methodology of beard stroking, I'm a fine one to talk, and really just ruminating over all the possibilities. Well, if we do that, and then if we tweak that, no, guys. Tick-tock, by the end of the 60s, got to be on the moon. So what happened in September 1963, and I came in aboard on this just after this, immediately after this, was that immediately after JFK was assassinated, NASA was in a massive transformation. What effect did the assassination have? It really solidified and eradicated doubters and detractors that we should be doing this when there were other very important national priorities going unaddressed. But the major changes that were occurring at NASA were to bring in that military influence. In '67, we had the Apollo fire, which killed 3 crew members. Those major changes, let me just say that particular segment of these line items, 140 plus US Air Force officers moved in with their fabulous systems management concepts. So where von Braun wanted for the Saturn V to launch 5 of just the first stage to prove that out, 5 with the first 2 stages, never getting into space with just those 2, and then another 5 with all 3 stages. George Miller, who came in September 1963, schooled in the space systems management concepts of General Bernard Shriver, who had built up America's massive ICBM arsenal, moved that concept of working, reinforced concurrency, forced the kind of pressure that actually resulted in the Apollo fire, but nevertheless got the job done. And if it had not been for those senior Air Force officers coming in to many levels of senior management at NASA and completely rewriting the script, we would not have been on the moon, and we would not have celebrated the 50th anniversary, 4 months ago. These were men that came in civilian clothes, but they brought their experience with them. NASA became a very different organization. We're all smarter. We all had crew cuts. We all wore bow ties. And we all said yes, sir, and no, sir, in the right and appropriate places. But it was a real sharp wake-up, shape-up operation. And it was slick. And as a young man in his early 20s, I can tell you, it was really intoxicating, because we felt we were on a roll. You know, sometimes when you know there's a big weather event occurring and you can feel it rolling toward you on the horizon, that is what we felt. We felt we're really going to get the kick up the what's it and really get going, and this is going to work for us now. And the pace and acceleration was phenomenal. So whereas von Braun would have had 7 or 8, actually, launches of the Saturn V at various intermediate stages before getting to the moon, he actually was able to, with that confidence that he didn't agree with initially, was able to get the first Saturn V flying, I think, in November 1967, and it was 100% successful. And all of the Saturn V's we launched were very successful, even though some of them came very, very close to disaster. The first manned Apollo flight, in October 68, the first flight around the moon. I'm sure many of you remember that extraordinary Christmas in 1968 when Borman, Lovell and Anders flew around the moon for the first time and read the first verses from Genesis. And it really galvanized a whole sense that we're really going to make this happen now. And from that point, the next one was the first flight of all the elements. Previously, the first manned Apollo flight, the first flight around the moon, had been just the command and service modules. Command module with the crew, and the service module with all the equipment. And the first flight of all elements took place with Apollo 9, where the lunar module was on a shakedown flight around in Earth orbit for about 11 days. To the moon, in moon orbit, down to just a few kilometers from the surface before coming back to the point where the crew would have started to actually land toward the surface. And then, of course, Apollo 11, July the 16th. And we had 6 further landings, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. You are aware, of course, of Apollo 13. The book I've done on Apollo 13 is there, a bit of personal experience of what it was really like, what we went through. It's quite a detailed discussion of that. The others were equally successful, but there were certain challenges and problems that we had on Apollo 13, which we'll come to in a moment. Very briefly, NASA's budget went from 100 million in 1968 to 5.2 billion within just 5 years, and then came down dramatically. There was bipartisan support for the moon program. There was no political edge on this. There was no lobbying from one political party. The 2 principal parties in the United States, of course, the Democrats and the Republicans. It was a Democrat president who instituted this, and it was on the watch of a Democratic President, Lyndon Johnson, after the assassination of Kennedy, that it really reached its peak. And conceded a need not to meddle during the hard years between 1961 and 64 when we went through all of these transformations, because that was one of the keys, not to stop and have all of these investigative commissions hold up the program before we could really move forward. And also, Lyndon Johnson was very supportive of NASA carrying out its own investigation after the 67 fire, and Congress was very approved as well of that approach, and it worked very, very well because NASA issued a warts and all report about the problems that had gone wrong. Just to give you an idea, strategically over time, this is how that budget went, and you can see here as a percentage of total federal outlay, it massively crashed. That's the moon landing year up there. It was already crashing during the period, and it was in there that we began development of the shuttle. The shuttle was underway before even the first landing on the moon. It did not fly until here, and we are now, today, extrapolating on, bumbling along there, at actually about 0.4% of federal expenditure. It's a proud boast of NASA for what it does and its main civilian mission in international space activities, that if you put together all of the budgets of NASA over its 60-year history, that would not come to 1 year's defense budget in America. And the $20 billion which NASA gives, which the American government gives NASA, returns $200 billion to the national economy through the kind of things a lot of what you folks are doing, that kind of tech, engineering, science leveraging, provides to the American economy more than the cost to the American government of its health, education, and welfare budget. So that's why NASA is the golden boy of American politics. They don't want to meddle with it because it's producing so much for so little. Has only 34,000 people working. But it provides an employment base in industry for, depending on the year, between 250,000 and 500,000 engineers and scientists in the United States, because it's all farmed out to commercial companies. The so-called commercialization of space now with SpaceX and with Jeff Bezos and all of those organizations, they are being sponsored by government money to develop these systems, as well as money from their own funds as well. But they are being paid. There's very little difference in this between paying Boeing, Northrop Grumman or Lockheed contracts to manufacture hardware. The massive space launch system is being built by Boeing. The Orion spacecraft that will put us back to the moon within the next decade, probably a lot earlier, is being built by Lockheed Martin. So that's seed money. That's direct contracting. These new entrepreneurs are actually providing money as well as receiving assistance from the government. It's a real private partnership arrangement with the government. So while we're looking at budget, extrapolating through to what's happening now, that's the way it's gone. But yeah, it's just 0.4%. America spends a lot more looking after its national parks each year. So I'm not saying it should be more, there are national priorities, but NASA is the world's biggest depository of Earth environmental resource data. And as most of the guys said, when we finished exploring the moon, we discovered a whole new planet. It's called Earth. And we wanted to fully understand it better than we had before. And from that image of Earth alone in the black velvet of space came the environmental movement we have today. America went environmentally crazy in the 70s. We were very much part of that. They banned CFCs in 1976. And that at a time when Europe was complaining that all this was just a ploy by the Americans to nobble European industries. So it's been a long time coming on this side of the pond, and notwithstanding the deference of some presidents, remember, presidents don't make the final decisions. And let me reassure right now that messages must continue to go out from qualified and knowledgeable people. And the various states, there's not one state in the Union spending now less money on environmental protection than it was when Trump came to power. So all this bluff and bluster, and I don't believe this, and I'm not spending that on that, Congress immediately puts the money straight back in. But you don't hear about that. You only hear the bluff and the bluster and the spectacular, dramatic line. So I'm proud of that. The fact that people can make a difference and that the states themselves, the individual states, are very, very signed up to these environmental issues. Anyway, back to what we are talking about. This is Kennedy on one of his last visits to a NASA center. That's the Mission Control Center at Kennedy Space Center. Lyndon Johnson there. That's Kurt Debus, who was the director of the Johnson Space Center, of the Kennedy Space Center. And that, of course, is Jim Webb, who was the director of NASA through the really difficult years. And this, toward the end, I think this was in November 63, literally just a few days before he was assassinated. The basic mission profile of an Apollo mission, I think you're very familiar with that, is to launch directly while the moon is over here, and so that you rendezvous in space and time when you converge at the point where the spacecraft passes the equigravisphere right there, where no longer is it in an elliptical Earth trajectory. If the moon wasn't there as this gravity well to suck it down, that would be an elliptical trajectory going way off and then back down around, straight like that. But right here, it begins then to be caught. And at that point, prior to Christmas in 1968, the first humans, after 200,000 years of modern human evolution, millions of years of primate evolution, billions of years of the planet's history, for the first time, living things were outside the gravitational attraction of the Earth. To many of us, that was a seminal moment of Apollo 8. And to many of us, it felt almost better than the landing itself, because the philosophical implications were most profound. That we could liberate ourselves from the umbilical of Mother Earth through gravity that had separated us. And you know, I use these terms, and this is how space people think. We think of whole planets. We don't think of maps with bits of red here and blue there and yellow there and orange there. And astronauts can get pretty feisty when asked by people about their political views about the division of humans on the Earth. And you better not be on the receiving end of most of their responses, because they don't see anything other than Homo sapiens, which is all of us. And that's something, you know, a message which is really quite profound. And that's one of the legacies from Apollo. But that moment, when humans for the first time moved out of the gravity well of Earth, was significant. It was instrumental in pointing us toward a future that one day, someday, when this solar system reaches the ends of its life, we can contemplate that over the next, if we don't destroy ourselves in the process, over the next several thousand years, if we may develop those technologies, sometimes it's hard to see we'll be around in that amount of time, we will have the opportunity to liberate ourselves from the demise of this solar system. And that is a profound responsibility. To me, it is as responsible as coexisting with all living things on this earth. And I do bring you this message that most people from NASA and from the space community would stand up here and say exactly the same thing, that nothing is more important than that, than the holistic inclusion of Earth, its living things and its systems, and that we see reflected in what we understand now about the Earth, all of the finest and most profound aspects of our systems engineering in the various elements that got us there. But considering systems engineering, let's just, I'm coming perilously close to my time, so I must move along a bit here. When we designed this vehicle, we needed heat, we needed cooling, we needed propulsion, we needed electrical power, and we needed a gaseous envelope in which to have the astronauts live in a pure oxygen environment. So what was developed was a system that would provide electrical power, water for cooling, rehydrating the food, and also the same system providing oxygen for the crew. And that came out of a fuel cell energy production system, which is similar to the process of reverse electrolysis, where you use an electric charge to separate hydrogen and oxygen. By bringing hydrogen and oxygen together over a nitrogen catalyst, as we did in the fuel cells that we used in Apollo, which we started flying on the Gemini manned spacecraft that was developed to precede Apollo to do all the test runs for the kind of designs we were working up for Apollo, the fuel cell system enabled us to produce about 2.5 kilowatts of electrical power, water by bringing together oxygen and hydrogen for the cooling system, rehydrating the hydrating the dehydrated food, and the oxygen bled off from the same tank that was mixed with the hydrogen in the fuel cell to produce electrical power. To me, the great lessons for our systems today, I'm very much against battery electric cars. Not only because of the slavish and despicable conditions under which lithium is mined by children in Chinese mines in Central Africa, but because it's one of the most toxic and unenvironmental elements that you can ever handle. A hydrogen-based energy economy based on what we were doing with our Gemini spacecraft from 1965, a hydrogen economy can produce propulsion for our cars without using any of the kind of battery systems we use now, a refueling time to replenish with hydrogen quicker than you can do that with an ordinary gas-guzzling car, and also a hydrogen economy could be used to replace gas in all of the gas central heating, the boilers and the burners that we use in our homes. One system of hydrogen, because we can convert the conduits and the lines that carry gas to boilers and home heating for less than the money that was spent, and many of you won't know what I'm talking about here, because you're too young, from going from basic imported gas to North Sea gas when we began to tap into the North Sea. When engineers went all over the country and they converted gas cookers, gas heating systems into North Sea gas. We could convert what we have now in all of those appliances to hydrogen for less expenditure than it cost the government then to convert every home in the country to North Sea gas. That was in the 1960s, I think, 1970s. So because our systems here for energy and for supporting the infrastructure are better positioned for business and for profit by going to batteries and lithium, talks I give to motor manufacturers from Ford to Bentley at each opposite end of the spectrum, not to dismiss Ford at all, but Ford have a bigger range than Bentley does. But every time I give this talk and mention this, heads nodding in agreement from engineers who spent their life in the automotive industries, because they have been lobbied by groups that realize, who run the automobile manufacturers, that this system would not accrue them as much profit. It costs 3 times the amount of money to build an electric car than it does a gasoline car. and the environmental price, great. At the curbside, it's the most eco-friendly thing you could have. But the moment you turn it on and start using it, it's environmentally destructive. And this is one of the things that we got. And people from the space program, from the Apollo program, recognize this because we had these different systems. And the overall design of the concept came within the service module. And looking down on the top, you can see here all the various sectors for the propellant, for the engine that put it into orbit. And then in one of the sectors, which that one's empty there, the fuel cells were in there, looking from the top right the way down the side there. And let me move through a little bit stronger. That's the service module in its structural form with the engine that puts it all into orbit. And this shows you the sectors with the propellant tanks in, and there you can see right at that point oxygen tanks, hydrogen tanks, and fuel cells in that. That's how we went all the way to the moon and back using fuel cells. 135 shuttle missions were launched with fuel cells. We've had hundreds of manned spaceflight missions run through this system. It's reliable, it's cheap, and it's far superior to all of this stuff that we're extracting using child labour from foreign-owned gangs who are dismissed from education simply because of the ownership of these mines. The thrust of the service module propulsion was about 89 kilonewtons. But that's irrelevant to this talk. Those are the integrated systems that you see there, the fuel cell system, 2 tanks for oxygen and hydrogen, 3 fuel cells, 1.5 continuous, maximum was about 2.5 at 28 volt direct current, power distribution, which was via 2 DC buses, and that's the total quantity to run a 10-day mission. That's all you need. You could run a car for 100,000 miles on the weight of gasoline and a lithium battery, so either one of those. So, you know, it's just mind-numbingly frustrating to see the way the politicians have directed it so that the minimum change to the manufacturing production lines, which is to build ordinary cars but with batteries rather than gas tanks. If we went to hydrogen with fuel cells in, it's a proven safe efficiency. So this is the meaning of what we do in space. We're showing the way for a better, environmentally friendly way to run our lives and our societies. Water production for drinking, and I've mentioned that. And that just shows one of the tanks there with its various accoutrements. And that's a slightly more detailed drawing of how the tanks were used to supply both oxygen to the crew and also to the fuel cells. And there's the system, the Apollo and the lunar module. And of course, the lunar module was different in that this used as batteries. It was meant to operate for just 3 days, so batteries were the optimum. The batteries to last for, and that's why we rejected batteries in Apollo. It's the same argument about cars today. Batteries would have weighed far too much to get the efficiency. It's an inefficient method, but the batteries for the lunar module were better because it was so short-lived in terms of the amount of power that was required. 2 basic systems weighed about 15 to 16 tons, and there with its legs folded prior to installation. But that's the engine which lowered you down to the surface. That's the engine which brought you back up. And the rest, of course, was history. LEM propulsion, there you see the various engines. The ascent propulsion system to get you off the moon, 16 kilonewtons, fixed thrust. The descent engine is 44 kilonewtons and could be throttled so that as the weight came down, as you were consuming more propellant, so you could proportionalize the deceleration rate. So the thrust leveling of the descent engine was vital, just like essentially a Harrier jump jet landing has to throttle back as the weight gets less and less and less. Otherwise, the impact of that on the weight will cause it to forever stay up. So you have to proportionalize that throttle to lower you down gently. And the descent propulsion system was there as a safety valve in the event that you had to return prior to powered descent initiation, starting your way down to the moon. So if the service module engine went out and was kaput, then until the point of going down to the moon, you still had this big engine on the other end of the lunar module that could power you back and bring the crew home. So we built in, within this system's architecture, the ability for rescue capability from other systems that would not have been used by the time they were needed. And the propellants, there's nitrous oxide, and unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, UDMH, which are hypergolic propellants which ignite on contact with each other. And that simplified the propulsion system and meant that you didn't have to have lots of valves opening and closing. You simply introduce the propellants into the combustion chamber. The revised trajectory of Apollo 13, of course, required a certain change in the degree of work that was required to get the crew back. That's one of the actual drawings with some changes made to the positioning of the hoses in order to stretch out a vehicle that was designed to last for 3 days, supporting 2 astronauts going down, to supporting 3 astronauts for up to 5 days. And that meant stretching out all of the consumables and all of the systems. Well, we're not really here to talk about just Apollo 13, but this is bootstrap engineering, where we were essentially looking around to see all the pieces of hardware that we had available. And that was a most inspirational time. We had a ball. It was absolutely fantastic. It was really exciting, really, really exciting. There was never any thought we'd lose the crew, because we couldn't allow ourselves that thought, because we would have failed had we not provided the crew with the means to get back. And he never said it, but Gene Kranz is quoted, "Failure is not an option." So there was that mindset. There was that sense of no. And I think the fact that our average age was 26 across the whole of the spectrum of the majority of people working on these programs, that cockiness of youth. And I will say unashamedly, it's very important. There are sparky years when new creative ideas must be let loose. You must have the freedom to say these things, even if they sound stupid. We were given that chance. And they tapped in as a government and political system to knowing that when you're that age, you think you've got a God-given right to change the world. Well, we were being given blank checks to do that. And so that was that feeling. And we must never take that away from our young today. It can be inspirational. Say the things that you've never heard said before. Look laterally both ways and get peer conversations going. Is this such a stupid idea? What if it is not so stupid? There must be that space and room within every academic institution, without any career option that one goes into. And it's so important. We saw it palpably within the space program. We could do things that hadn't even been invented because half this stuff hadn't been invented. Nobody knew how to do it a year before we could even decide how the heck we go to the moon. And tick-tock, tick-tock, the clock is ticking, and here again on this mission, tick-tock, tick-tock, we've got to get these guys back. Several thousand engineers at scores of contractors all over the United States. Emergency phone lines were installed. No, of course, no cell phones or even, let alone smartphones. And the whole of the nation came alive. Hotlines between NASA and the prime contractors. There were 20,000 individual companies that were specialized in providing. There was 500,000 people working at the contractors on this. And NASA's personnel level bloated to about 40,000, which is a very small factory indeed if you're manufacturing anything. But nearly 500,000 people out there in industry, all mobilized 24/7 during the crisis. This is an actual handwritten note, that's in the book as well, which is part of the schematic of how the heck do we get these systems working in a totally different way to that which they were designed and implemented to accomplish. So the mailbox, because of the need to extract exhaled carbon dioxide, we used lithium hydroxide flowing through canisters to filter the CO2, keeping it down admirably below 7.5 millimeters of mercury of CO2. Otherwise, very strange psychedelic things happen to you, and that's not a state you want to be in if you have to have mind-sharp crispness in operating all of these systems. So that system was defunct because we had the different size of lithium hydroxide canisters in the Apollo spacecraft, which had been shut down because half the side had been blown off. And we were running on the lunar module, which had a different shape of lithium hydroxide canister. So you had to bootstrap it by using the command module's lithium hydroxide canisters, of which there are a lot. And that's the basic system. In a moment, I will show you. And this is really what I've just been talking to you about. Now, levels were reaching twice the safety level, producing a lot of headaches and nausea on the part of the crew. They were fighting knowing what was working up. So all the time, tick tock, not just to get the crew back, but to stop them asphyxiating on their own exhalation of carbon dioxide. And so the mailbox was activated at 93 hours 53 minutes, which was essentially to take that square command and service module box like that and route it outside the circular canisters that should have been taking in air from the filters through the system and pushing out clean air on a recycling basis. So these boxes were essentially made up of duct tape. Yes, they did carry it. And was known as the mailbox because it looks like an American mailbox in the wetland. And we had another one put up in the tunnel up in there because the guys used to go up there into the very cold Apollo spacecraft to sleep, but that was worse because the CO2 obviously will flow under pressure into the coldest zone, and so we were getting this great big well of CO2, carbon dioxide, right in the area where we wanted the crew to sleep. So we had to rig up another one, or the crew did, to get up there into the region of the tunnel. Consumables on Apollo 13. This is a tricky, I'm running way over my time, about 2 minutes, and I'll be closed down on this first session. Oxygen was in abundance, because in the lunar module, we had 2 periods when we were going to depressurize the lunar module, completely venting the oxygen right out. So because we had no moonwalks to go on, there was no venting of this oxygen out of the spacecraft. So we had essentially a line coming right off there. This is a chart, a normalized chart of how we would have an oxygen flow rate from about 105 hours to 140 hours. It's about 33 hours of a landing and surface stay on the surface of the moon. So because we weren't on the surface and because we didn't have these great expulsions and then have to completely recharge again, we had abundant oxygen in there. Water consumption on coolant demand proportional to power. So the more we powered down, the more water we could save, but we had to budget, and one of my jobs was to budget how much peak we would need when we began to turn everything on. It wasn't a linear fact. You couldn't say, well, how many hours, how much water is there left, how much power are we going to have in the batteries from the lunar module. We were going to have to light up the whole thing like a Christmas tree to get the guidance platform equations back over into the command and service module, which we didn't even know was capable of being powered up again. All this was, that's the focus. Forget about whether the command and service module can't power up a couple of hours before they're about to re-enter. If it doesn't, it doesn't. There's nothing you can do about it until you power it up, so forget. And that's the focus. You can be too panicked by lateral and peripheral things. And there are zones of conscious awareness, 3 zones of focus in order to completely concentrate and not allow your brain to be cluttered by extraneous activities. And that's why shutting everything out except the task you're working on makes you super efficient and gets you the solutions that normally would elude you. And we learnt that, and this was taught within various schools. A lot of psychologists started moving in on how NASA ran its programs. NASA lessons were fed actually into psychology courses because of the way we trained these guys to work. And we all morphed into these zones of being able to work. And there's nothing like it, saturating yourself with a focus and the task at hand, then going to the next one. So that is a methodology that worked here. So they asked people like me to work out how much power we would need at peak boost and what that would do to the water that was remaining. So you had to hold in reserve as though the mission was much longer because you'd need a lot more in order to get the crew into a condition that could bring them back. Battery life depended on the systems enabled. Power was down from 45 amp hours. 45 amp hours was about the normal running power of a lunar module separating, floating down, landing on the surface and coming back. Powered the whole spacecraft down to 12 amp hours, and that little calculation there shows that we had 336 watts for a 20-volt DC circuit. So all of this balancing of the consumables was the real art, and that is really the story of Apollo 13, how we managed all these systems, how it worked in these various ways. Right. Now, very quickly moving through, what did we do with these missions? Well, after the first 3, which had essentially the second and the third landings were with the basic hardware. But some of us were catapulted out of 11 into the J-series missions, Apollos 15, 16, and 17, where we would have very considerably extended. Instead of having 2 moonwalks lasting about 4 hours each, we would have 3 moonwalks of 8 hours each. And they would stay on the surface for nearly 4 days on each landing. So we massively expanded the capabilities and really had already designed into the systems before we completed the design for the landing, growth potential without major incursions on weight or system spread. And I've always said it's what I call, really in a culinary analogy, always start by choosing the pudding so you don't stuff up on your digestion by having a first course. And what I mean by that is always plan for where you want to go after your initial goal is completed. And we had the expansion and the capability, and that was a glorious period that I spent working with these guys to expand and extend the period that we would spend on the surface of the moon, and with lunar roving vehicles. 7 hours EVAs, extravehicular activities, spacewalking, moonwalking. That means you spend about 8.5 hours in the suits. Use of a lunar roving vehicle to minimize the time you were going between geological sites of interest, and also to gain a greater reach so that you could get to more places. Science tasks for the command module in lunar orbit. And this is the lunar roving vehicle, and that's how it came out of its chrysalis, folded up. It really was an origami design in terms of getting that out and unfolded. And with a series of lanyards pulling, there was no heave-ho, chaps. It was pulling lanyards, and it sprang out with various cantilevered support struts. And this is that wonderful picture of Apollo 15, where we had the lunar roving vehicle out for 3 glorious days at the Hadley-Pennine site in the middle of 1971. And there's Apollo 15 at Hadley Rill. That rill is half a mile. It's about 3/4 of a kilometre wide, and they're just down there on the slope sampling. But this is just to give you a general impression of how very different to the Apollo 11 site were those later missions, and how the enormous wealth of information that we got back to understand this biplanetary system really worked. And that, to me, is a very telling picture, because we were asking the crew to go a long, long way away. That's the only little place that's a link between getting back into moon orbit and from there moving across and going back to Earth itself. So it requires an appropriate mindset to know that if everything fails, and you're in the smallest spacecraft of all, which has its own batteries, its own communication systems. These guys were in agony and pain for much of the spacewalking. The gloves were very tight. Fingernails bled as they were eased off the end of the fingers. The lunar dust is like graphite powder. It sticks to everything and grinds even on the circular lock clips on the gloves, on the grinding. Well, when your life depends on that being a tight air seal, when you hear it grinding through muck and dust, and the graphite particles that were like sharp little needle-like things, it wasn't easy at all. These guys came back looking as though they'd been at the coalface for 3 days, let alone 3 days on the moon. Orbital science was conducted by a whole battery of instruments in the command and service, in the service module. And these are the sites that we visited. Apollo 11 right there, Apollo 12 right over there. Apollo 14 went to the site that 13 should have landed at. 15, 16, and 17. These very, very difficult to access because we had precision landing worked out in the previous missions, Apollo 12 actually, whose 50th anniversary is in a few weeks, in a few weeks' time. And total EVA times. This gives you an impression, as we come to the close of this, that is the amount of time, 160 man-hours spent out on the lunar surface from these various missions. And you can see there how we built up cumulative so it's cumulative on each mission, 11, 12, 14, 15, and 16. Look how the J missions enabled a quantum leap in the ability to spend time out on the surface. And the total samples collected, you see there, and that, apologies, is in Old English money. And that just shows the enormous expansion of the capability there. And finally, the traverse distance. Well, obviously, with a lunar roving vehicle, you're really going to go. And there you see, look at the enabling distance from these walkabouts to these rideabouts. And while they sounded jocular, that's a mechanism for getting by when you know your life is threatened and you're undergoing situations in which you could die at any moment. When they were right away, they had, remember I told you they had batteries and biomed harnesses on with telemetry, giving heart rate, respiration rate, everything. Sent back on telemetry to the lunar module, which was sent back to Earth. You needed to keep your electrolytes up, so they had an orange juice in a bag. On one of these crews, when it just got outside, the bag burst and drenched the entire inside of his suit with electrical cables, biomed harnesses, batteries in there, not knowing for the next several hours whether instantly there'd be zzz, and that was the last we heard of Charlie Duke. But that was the kind of conditions, and nobody knew this on the ground. Nobody just got on with the job. You just did it, you know. So these guys did not have the kind of easy ride that maybe even the films like to portray. And this again is the and is it possible, Mr. Technician up there, to put these lights down for a moment? Because let me just show you. It doesn't come off right. See the condition of that suit? And that is what you look like when you've been out on the moon, when you're not on TV. And that kind of dust and dirt, that is the biggest challenge we're going to face as we come up to going back to the moon. That is a problem for the respiratory tract. It's a problem for the cardiovascular system. We had a cardiac arrest on the moon. We had a very close one coming back to Earth and another astronaut. Now that information is in the public domain. These guys were on the edge, and now we know that Neil Armstrong was suffering. He had a heart rate at some of these points of 220. I can't even get my heart up that way if I'm trying. But this was absolutely extraordinary. And so the biomedical data that we have had is phenomenal. And dust is a killer, lunar dust. So essentially the lessons which we learned, and that actually is a lunar module that never went into space, but it is actually integrated systems approach is vital to prevent operational lockouts. What I mean by that is keep the system as broad, as capable, and as wide as you can, because you may very well be called upon in emergencies to use them so that you're not locked out by the actual operations. Mission designed to start with an expectation of failure and designed back to contingency levels. That's really what I harked into just a little while back. So everything you design to start with failure. How are we going to accommodate if this fails? How are we going to accommodate if that fails? Even the tanks in the lunar module descent stage were increased in size in order to give it the propulsive oomph to get the crew back if the service module engine was not operable for some technical reason when they got to the moon. Designed for the fact that it might be used as a lifeboat. And oh, yes, of course, it was on Apollo 13, used as a lifeboat. And the fact that we had that propulsive capacity there, more than we needed just to land on the moon, paying the penalty of extra weight was worth it because it was critical in bringing the Apollo 13 back. When we had the Apollo fire, we went to fully containing in potting every single strand of electrical wire. If that fire had not occurred, and we had had open looms behind fire panels in the spacecraft, the freezing temperatures with moisture and condensation in the Apollo spacecraft as it was getting close to freezing, coming back from the moon with everything shut down. We did a study, the university in America did a study, and it is 100% certain that those electrical systems required to get the crew back in Apollo 13 would have shorted out long before they got anywhere near Earth, unless they had been sealed completely in potting to completely prevent any moisture of any kind, let alone water, getting into those wires. And so, even when you prepare for the worst, you're sometimes outdone by the severity of situations. And so, tragically, even the Apollo fire, which we developed fireproof paper. Fires were started inside mock-up spacecraft to show that the fires went out, even in a pure oxygen environment. Now, flame propagation rates in pure oxygen is really scary stuff. It's like a Bunsen burner lighting up, you know, just a little flame starting. And that was part of the reason why we were able to save many, many, many missions during this whole period that could easily have ended in failure. Management integration is essential. Get integrated with your people. Really, really, Von Braun would come down at night in shirt sleeves, director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, designer of the Saturn V, all the Saturn series of rockets, sit down on a stool as the floor sweeps were coming in, call them over, pull up a stool and say, sit down, he'd get to know what the names were. I've got a problem. I need your fresh pair of ears on this and your fresh mind. And many times he came out with somebody who was not in the forest of decision-making, who saw a simple solution and advised Von Braun. He said, got it. Of course, that's it. That's teamwork. That's management, not projecting your own way things should be done, but actually harnessing the best resources you have around you and the best talent that you've got in your proximity and under your control, and positioning people in spaces where they are best employed at specific functions that they've got unique talents for. So that's what I mean by that. Management integration it's not about top-down and not altogether totally lateral. There must be a sense of who's calling the shots. But the guys calling the shots must listen beyond their own levels of, oh, well, that's decided, isn't it? No. Listen. And listen to other people. And that's what we were told as young kids. You know, we were given things to do that hadn't even been thought of or invented at that time, and actually given ears to our voices. And I felt that was how we were able to mobilize in just 8 years to go from aeroplanes to moon landings in 8 years. And it's arguably why we can't do it anymore in the time that we could do it then. But that's a whole other story. But this is really seriously important. Functional fit between contractors on design specs and engineering. The different lithium hydroxide canisters for CO2 filtering. Who the heck allowed one contractor for one spacecraft to build square boxes, another contractor to build round boxes, when we were already designing the possibility of using the lunar module as a lifeboat? Hello, did we not need then to use very long life lithium hydroxide canisters? And full and effective reporting, so that whistleblowers, NASA has at each of its centers and throughout its institution, it has the mission statement that NASA is an organization which will have non-attributable reporting in or whistleblowing. Every employer has anonymous reporting capacity. And NASA, actually, this is really quite good, all of this stuff, NASA is voted by employees as the best government department to work for in the United States, which is why the age has gone from 26 when I was starting in, up to 55 now, because nobody wants to leave. It's such a lovely place to work. And find it, build, test, and test again. And I think that's my range of lessons learned that we came through from the Apollo program. Trust and respect for off-nominal views probably is the most outstanding baseline, one-sentence message that we can get for everything that we learned. What I want to tell you now, MPAD stands for Mission Planning and Analysis Division, and that frames just the period that I was involved with the Apollo program. Of course, my operations with NASA went right the way on through the shuttle and into the space station era. But what I want to talk about in this particular section is about some of the problems that were faced. I've got a couple of video clips within this, and also to give you an idea of just the techniques that were used to actually get down on the surface. So it's to give you a generalized impression, not to require you to take an exam after it. Oh, but didn't I tell you? And so really what, without further ado, let us go on. Apollo flight plans. I wonder if it's possible to lower the intensity of the lights just on here. Would that compromise any photography or anything, just to get a better... Oh, I think that's really fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. They're the guys who run the show, you know. You've got to keep friends with those chaps. Apollo flight plans, okay, which were very, very important, and I think it introduces to many of you how we had a very different way of communicating information to the crew. There was no direct way of reprogramming the computer. There was no specific way of changing any of the systems information that was already installed before launch. Every single input that went in that was advised by the ground had to be manually inserted. And guess what? Yes, paper and pencil was used to take down all the numbers and all the advisories as we went through the flight, which is why if you really listen to these missions and the mission commentaries, you'll hear whole strings of numbers going out, and I'll talk to that in just a moment. So I don't want to clog it up with lots of boring information, but flight plans were really seriously important. And what is the flight plan? Well, essentially, it provided the crew with all of their activities, and it was basically written up before the mission in order to give the crew a fixed timeline and a sequence of events that never actually worked out as we actually expected it to, but that was the general idea. And it was to be used by the flight crew themselves, the flight control team in the Mission Operations Control Room at what was then the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, now the Johnson Space Center. It was used by program management as a reference tool. This was a document, maybe I would say about 2 to 4 centimeters thick. I was going to bring a couple of my own flight plans along, but you can see it from the screen stuff that I give you anyway. And we all use these. Just as pilots carry on that flight bag, that big black flight bag, so the astronauts didn't actually carry on their flight bag. It was actually installed by crews, but the documentation on board was incredible. There were no digital readouts. There were no digital displays. There were merely push-button options for selected items to be lit up or non-lit. And so every single reference had to be used to a sheet of paper, which is why we produced fireproof paper after Apollo fire in order that this would be safe in the spacecraft. Remember I said earlier that we actually tested spacecraft with fireproof interiors because of the fire. So the paper came along with that as well. And it was a reference for future mission planning and evasive correction. And this is the Apollo 11. This is a scan I did of my Apollo 11 flight plan there. Command and Service Modules 107, Apollo Saturn 506, and LEM number 5. This was produced by the appropriate authors. Lunar Surface Operations Plan, that's another thick document which detailed every single step of what was planned to carry out on the surface. Modified dramatically on later flights when we had direct link with television on the lunar roving vehicle, which went along with the crew. So as they repositioned themselves at various station stops, we called it, for the different places they were going to stop, all this from very high resolution lunar photography to plan the geologic route. They didn't just go wandering off and look at interesting things. It was all mechanistically worked out with the scientists working with the crew, the time on the lunar roving vehicle. There had a lot of constraints that had to be built into the Lunar Surface Operations Plan. For instance, what happens if you're 7 kilometers away from the lunar module and your backpack breaks down? You will need oxygen to get back 7 kilometers. So we had a buddy system whereby there were pipes and lines between the two which could scavenge for the second crew member off the first. Remember I told you, design for failure? And then we had to work out, and this is one of the things I worked out extensively, was, okay, supposing the lunar rover fails, the buddy system will be fine, but we mustn't have them going so far away that if the lunar roving vehicle fails and they have to walk back and then a suit fails, so they were constrained in the radius they could go purely by all these safety features that were built in. So planning all that came into the flight plan, and that's what it constituted. And flight plan development, it was actually produced by a typewriter on flight plan forms. It seems very archaic even talking about it now. And of course, there were many editions of this as simulations and crew training. The crew really generally it took about 1.5 to 2 years to train for a mission. But this was the general back structure of everything that went on. Commander Service Module and Lunar Module had specific flight plans as well. And of course, air to ground and a ballpoint pen, which of course was a major challenge on Apollo 13 because they had to, every single thing was completely different. From the flight plan, of course, obviously. So there was such a lot of read-ups, and because of the condition of the crew, with freezing temperatures, with ice forming on the windows, they were absolutely tired out and cold, and began to develop certain unsavory medical conditions associated with the bowel due to the conditions under which they were living for 2 days. And so bowel infections began to set in. There were people working on the medical side looking at the outgassing of materials, how they would affect the reduced immune system in the crew as they were being taken to a very low physical state of happiness and efficiency in terms of their body systems. So all of these had to be accommodated through changes actually read up, and no electronic planning system whatsoever. So this is what a flight plan page looked like for Apollo 11. And again, this is just of academic interest. This is the timeline in hours and minutes, 96 hours to 108 hours. So that's a fairly wide band of time. Shows here when it undocked. This is the operations for the Apollo mothership, Commander Service Module. This for the Lunar Module. This is here from 108 hours to 120 hours. For the Commander Service Modules and the Lunar Module. EVA, the spacewalk, post-EVA, EAT period, the rest period, 4 hours, 40 minutes, and so on. None of this ever went exactly as it was planned. In fact, it was planned on the, here you will see, and this is a point I should point out, that when Neil and Buzz landed, they got touchdown right there, which is pretty much on the timeline. Their plan was to eat and then to have a rest. And Neil said, how anybody expected us to go through all of that to make the first landing and then go to sleep? And Neil had worked out with the flight crew personnel in the Mission Planning and Analysis Division that it would be perfectly satisfactory if they made the decision themselves, and they said, we can't go to sleep. We're going to have to go out. So that was why they changed the content of the plan, went out first. And there was wise, logical deduction in that, because if we had a problem with them later, nobody knew the condition of the vehicle. The shock and the vibration of landing, of great immediate concern, was venting, and if any of the conduits or the propellant lines had ruptured, whatever, that you'd have to get off the moon pretty quick in order to get back safely. If you'd spent your time sleeping and not on rock collecting on the very first landing, wow, talk about a red face. So there was operational veracity in that. And Neil Armstrong was not the kind of guy just to say, oh, I can't possibly go to sleep, I'm going out now. It was for that reason, the operational reason. Right, well, we need to get out there in case something happens and we have to lift off early. Okay, and this is the detailed timeline, which suppresses and collapses the timeline to just 1 hour in that, and this is more detailed. So there are various segments of the flight plan which went into a much more detail. Well, you get the idea. All these various things around the side. MSFN is Manned Spaceflight Network. That's when, for the Commander Service Module, which is going around the far side of the moon, that is the period in hours and minutes on this particular page when it is within sight of Earth around the near side. And these various other places, that's the attitude of the two vehicles, and so on and so on. Because this is the page before it starts descending, with touchdown, of course, right there. Stay, no stays, T1 and T2, that's when we had the crew and the ground look at the condition of the spacecraft and give them the reassurance that they could stay and that there was no technical reason that their lives were imperiled. That's another one for the lunar module, EVA, with the commander's tasks and the lunar module pilot's tasks divided. Just gives you an idea of how really detailed, choreographed and orchestrated all of these particular missions were. Okay. This is one of the maneuver charts. Every time we needed to put information into the computer, we had to have the crew write down on these cards, and they were about that size, a continuous series of numbers which was not cognizant of these zeros or pluses. So mission control would start reading out all of these, and they go consecutively, filling in. So you wouldn't have to go 0, 0, then something, something. This is the pitch and the yaw trim on the spacecraft. This is ground elapsed time to ignition in the Noun 33. The computer operated on a verb and a noun basis, so that you installed the noun and then applied the verb to decipher the intention of the operation. These were not word processors, which is what people call computers these days. They're not computers. So these, of course, were wire cores prepared and installed and wired in to the most robust and resilient computers that have ever been made. And the fact that in tens of thousands of hours of operation there was not a single failure is due essentially to the fact that, unlike today, the moment you can get a reset and a restart just in the normal course of events, because it cannot cope with overloads. Computers will just say, hands up, enough. That's why all the way from smartphones right the way through to conventional PCs, across that set of platforms for keying information to a display screen, you will find that they're operating right on the least resilient construction methodology, as well as operational capability, because they know you can reset. These things were not to be intervened with by humans from the moment they were made, and the nouns were wound into the cores within the computers. And I've got a bit of a video shortly, very shortly, coming up, which really explains that, and I think is very, very, very important indeed. But this is these are the various, that's what these various purposes were. No, I'm not expecting you to, let alone read, certainly not memorize all that, but that's what all these various things were. The sextant and the shaft and the trunnion angles on the sextant, for instance, for aligning with star settings. So you can see why they had to live, eat and breathe these systems and not get bothered about the politics or the budgets of the program or anything else. This is really hard focused stuff. But that's really just to give you a general idea of how that worked. Guidance and navigation, we had an inertial platform, which essentially, and I mean, what is up and down and forward and backward in space? Well, what you have to do is, just as we have an established frame of reference for an airplane, which is the Earth's horizon and the center of gravity down to the center of the Earth, when you're in space and there's no reference, you establish a REFSMAT. That's an acronym for Reference Stable Member Matrix, which means you set up your coordinates. You do your own drawing of a coordinate. It may be one line might be between the Earth and the Moon. Another axis may be between the spacecraft and the sun, and the other axis will be part of the pitch roll in your axis. The other axis will be a star. Could be Rigel, could be Canopus, could be any star that you designate. And we had star calendars that they are able for the time of year to be able to use. So you establish it, and that established your frame of reference. So then every movement of roll, pitch, and yaw was around that reference. So you were autonomously within space without actually being slaved to the surface or the contours of any one world in the solar system. So that's the way we will always travel in space. You probably heard it first in Star Trek, but that's how we did it at NASA, and that's how it was worked. So the inertial measurement platform is in 3 orthogonal axes, pitch, roll, and yaw, and you set those up so that it stays firm. And so that stays firm on the REFSMAT that you've inserted into the gimbal angles, because these are like 3 spinning gyroscopes at orthogonal axes, pitch, roll, and yaw. So the spacecraft moves around, pitch, roll, and yaw. When you see it tilting and pushing over, that gimbal platform stays exactly internally, and that's why they're spinning very, 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 very fast. And so you can get gimbal lock, where two will come right over each other, and that completely destroys one of the problems we had in Apollo 13 was not to go into gimbal lock with the platform coordinates, which were totally different, a completely different refs mat, because we were using a different spacecraft that wasn't supposed to go on navigation between Earth and Moon, the lunar module. See how we literally had to design things that had never been done previously. This is the sextant and the telescope, the optical assembly, right the way alongside there. And you see, that's the side of the command and service module. The conical command module like that, remember it? The command module, pressurized. Down, the couches would be along here. That's the opposite wall to that. Down there, the couches along there. So they would drift down, float down, look so it's standing, and had a controller there which enabled him to swing the spacecraft around to point and roll it, to point at a star. And there was a certain degree of movement in pitch and yaw for the telescope and the sextant, so that you could drive them through the slight. You get to a rough approximation by maneuvering the whole spacecraft, and then you'd fine-tune it, and you then measure the gap between the established wideband of the spacecraft's attitude to the narrow band of the guidance platform. So it really enabled you to do very, very complex guidance calculations. We determined right at the beginning of the program that the computers were on the ground would make all the decisions about the trajectory, but the crew knew that if communication was lost, they'd have to navigate their way home. And that's why on every single flight, the command module pilot, that's the guy who stayed in the mothership and didn't go down to the surface, always used to test himself against the numbers that came up from Houston as to the specific place they were. And every time the guys were getting to within fractions of an arc second of what values the ground had computed from the vast assembly of the RTCC, the real-time computer complex, these vast rooms of computers that would make this look like a little canteen. And that was where the real brains of Apollo was. We didn't want it in the spacecraft. There was no need to have all this over-computerized power. Don't put it where it doesn't need to be. And it doesn't need to be there, just, but give them, with what they have, the focused product that they can use to get back safely. And this is a picture of Jim Lovell on Apollo 8 doing the specific sightings in his suit, you see there, down in that location. So we had the AGC in the Apollo CSM, the Apollo Guidance Computer. We had the primary guidance and navigation systems in the lunar module. They're basically the same, the PINGs and the AGs. We call them different names to instantly denote what we were talking about in terms of where they were located in which spacecraft. But they were essentially the same. And there was the ABS, which is the AGS, which is in the lunar module, was doing nothing, and it was never ever used. But that, if the pings went out in the lunar module, that system, that guidance system that knew every second where it had to fire the spacecraft to get back to the mothership, if that was the only means of instantly providing a direct route by firing up the ascent engine and going straight, that was the job of the AGS. So we built for failure at every step of the way, and that's why we had so many problems, but were able to handle them, because we built it not to fail, but in case it did fail, and in the expectation that it probably would, because we'd never done any of this before. So there was no guarantee that it would all work as we were very confident that it would. Deep Space Network, those are the three big ears, which are essentially 85-foot dishes in English money, essentially 120-degree intervals around the Earth. So no matter what spin rotation of the Earth, the Moon was always in sight. So we'd always have one of the Deep Space Network dishes able to lock on with high-gain S-band antennas. That's in the 2-something gigahertz frequency band, and that was the band we used for S-band communications to get most of the telemetry back, reading from the instruments and the consoles. Also, there was a rendezvous radar for ascent and rendezvous in the command and service module to know what the LEM was doing, because there were operational techniques for using the mothership to go down if the lunar module lifted off and the engine had sputtered out before getting into proper orbit. The service module could go down, the command and service module, the mothership could go down and rendezvous, and so it had to know where that was at all times with the rendezvous radar and onboard navigation, which brings us back full circle to where we were before. This is a breadboard test of the flight director attitude indicator, which takes the products of the gimbal platform and displays it. That's known as the 8-ball because of the fact that it has positioning points 2, 4, 6, 8, and is essentially what pilots use for blind flying. So you have the Earth essentially there for flying. With that, you have the attitude of the spacecraft. So that enables you to be able to do the real jet jockey stuff and actually fly your spacecraft like an aeroplane. And that was essential for knowing the positioning. And these, those are the control. That is the control for thrusting forward or backward. These are the attitude controllers for roll, pitch, and yaw. So, and you can point anywhere in space and still keep going in the same direction because there's no air there to deflect you or against which you need to have resistance. And this is what the DISCI, display and keyboard is. You see, NASA actually stands for Never a Straight Answer. And so all these acronyms, oh God, alphabet soup, as we used to call it. The book of acronyms in the Apollo program was thicker than the flight plans that we took to the moon. Because, you know, you got used to these, but then occasionally you'd see something, what is that, you know, and quick scurry to the... but this is the DISCI, the display and keyboard assembly, where you program in all of the information. So all those numbers, first of all, you'd punch in the areas of the, where's the, let me just get this correct here. Yeah, there's the nouns, and so program 13, then you use the noun, then the verb, then you punch in all of this data with the keyboard here. And there's one of those down at the navigation station, and there was one up on the flight control displays. And so that's how we got information into, because there's no uplink that could automatically put this up into the
there has been much speculation
Watch
by
this.
some as to how the flight computer aboard the Apollo missions managed to get men to the moon when it had just a tiny fraction of the computing power of something like a modern smartphone. But this is quite misleading, as there was not one solitary computer controlling the Apollo craft. There were 4 computers, and there were no fancy touchscreens, GUIs or other things in a typical computer of today to waste resources on. The first of the 4 computers was the Saturn Launch Vehicle Digital Computer, or LVDC. This got the rocket from the launch pad to the Earth orbit. Then there was the Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC. This is the one that most people think of. There were in fact 2 of them, one in the command module to get from Earth orbit to the moon and then back again. The second was in the lunar lander and would control the landing and then the ascent back to the command module and docking. The 4th computer was one which was never used on any missions because it would control an emergency abort and ascent should something happen during the descent to the moon's surface, like the landing computer failing or they ran out of fuel. The Apollo Guidance Computer wasn't as dumb as many make it out to be. As time went by in Apollo's development, the tasks that it was meant to do increased in both number and sophistication. This, in turn, created ever more issues with the limited resources available. One of the biggest problems was the limited amount of memory due to the technological limitations of the time. This meant that the programmers had to make use of every single byte available. The AGC also had a unique operating system. Systems like Unix, Linux, Windows, and Apple iOS are in control and share out time to the programs. In the AGC, the programs controlled how much time they got depending on how important they were. So in the case of an emergency, the highest priority programs would get the most amount of time, and non-essential operations were dropped to free up resources, which became the basis of mission-critical systems for all manned missions afterwards. The computer had a performance somewhere around that of the first generation of personal computers, like the Apple II, Commodore PET, Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, which all arrived 10 years later in the late 1970s. It had 2K of RAM and 36K of fixed storage rope core memory, or ROM. Now this was woven by hand and took months to assemble, so any software bugs were literally woven into the system. A comparison between the Apollo guidance computer and, say, an iPhone 6 is tricky because the AGC was not a general purpose computer. It was built for a very specific task and had a unique operating system. That, and also the 48-year gap in the technologies used, mean that we can only get a very rough estimate on the difference in performance. The Apple iPhone 6 has an ARM A8 processor, which has about 1.6 billion transistors in it. The AGC had just 12,300. This iPhone 6 has 1 gigabyte of RAM, about 488,000 times that of the AGC, and this one, 128 gigabytes of non-volatile storage, about 3.5 million times that of the AGC. As for performance, the iPhone 6 is maybe somewhere between 4 and 30 million times faster than the AGC, depending upon what type of calculations are being done. And if you include the iPhone's GPU, it will be even more. So if you had to fly back to the moon in an Apollo craft, and given a choice, would you trust your life to a couple of iPhones in place of the AGCs? Because you would actually have more computing power in just one of these than the whole of NASA had during all the Apollo missions. However, if your iPhone crashed, you would be in big trouble, whereas the ancient AGC was designed to recover from crashes and overloads and continue by itself. In essence, it was designed to be crash-proof, something that is needed in a mission-critical situation. The problem we have here is in the context in which we see the Apollo computer today. We are now surrounded by computers hugely more powerful, and we don't give them a second thought. It's very difficult for most people who are not computer engineers or assembly language programmers to imagine how you could do anything with such limited resources. What we forget is, at the time of the design in 1962, that this was to be the first embedded computer. It was a huge leap forward in miniaturized computing, from something the size of a large room to a size of a briefcase. It would also be a giant leap forward for software programming, and the first time that software would be used for real-time problem solving that would be key to the entire mission. If it failed, people could die. But its development was far from easy. It's said that if the designers had known in 1961 what they learned later, or had a complete specification when given the contract to make it, they would have most likely concluded that it would just not have been possible with early 1960s technology. The contract for the design, development and construction of the Apollo guidance, navigation systems and software was given to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in August 1961, instead of NASA's normal computer contractors, IBM. But there was no specifications given in the contract because no one at NASA really knew what the requirements of an Apollo computer would be at that early stage. As the project developed throughout the 1960s, it became apparent that the task was going to be much more difficult than they first considered. And by the mid to late 60s, the problems in the computer's development were in danger of sinking the entire Apollo program if they couldn't get the AGC to work. By the time of testing in 1966 for the ill-fated Apollo 1, it became apparent that the bugs in the software meant that the AGC could not be relied upon to do the navigational course calculations, as it was just not accurate enough, something that could put the craft in the wrong orbit when it returned to Earth. It was decided that IBM mainframe computers on the ground would do the course calculations and then send them to the AGC in the command module to be implemented. This way round, known limitations could be worked around with much more powerful ground-based computers and the results sent to the AGCs. However, the command module had to be capable of working independently if the ground link was broken, like when it was flying behind the moon or if someone tried to actually jam the signal. So, using a combination of the inertial guidance system and the built-in sextant to check the star positions, they could still navigate without the ground link data. As for the lander, the round-trip delay of 1.5 seconds for the signals to get to the moon and then back to Earth would have been too long for the ground control to remotely land the descent stage because the feedback needed to be in real time. To this end, the descent stage AGC would work with the landing radar and the astronauts to land on the moon. This led to the Apollo 11 landing almost being aborted when a design bug in the landing radar which had been left on standby during the descent in case of an emergency abort, created a flood of signals and overloaded the AGC, setting off computer error code alarms just before the landing. Due to the AGC's design, instead of crashing or locking up like we might expect our iPhone or a normal computer to do, it dropped all but the most important tasks before then restarting itself. This was not a fault, it was called reset protection. The AGC was designed so that all the current data it was working on was stored. This meant that it could be turned off and on again or reset at any time, and it would just continue to work from where it left off. A bit like when your PC goes to sleep mode and then comes back again, but much, much quicker. These features saved the mission from aborting and allowed Armstrong to control the orientation of the lander whilst the AGC controlled the descent to a successful landing. It's things like this that made what is now about as powerful as the microcontroller in a toaster get men to the moon and safely back again 6 times. It also created a paradigm shift not only in space exploration, but also computing for the future. And as always, thanks for watching, and please subscribe, rate, and share.
Okay, well, that was just a generalized view, which I thought repeated and put together some of the things that we were talking about just then. There's quite a lot that I had prepared, and we're running out of time, and I don't want to give you starvation complex for not having opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through the next few slides. Just to let you see this sound scriber. This is the recording equipment. I'll let you just show that down. Which was used to record all these things that you see now played through and copied across into first tape and then onto digital formats. So even the very presence of recording things in the 1960s was really groundbreaking work. And these were, a lot of this came out of the Second World War. So there's a whole story behind all of that. And these sound scribers are now kept in various museums around the world, but really they were key to being able to record all the various events which took place. Lunar landing strategy. I'm going to move beyond all this because I think you may be getting saturation point with all of this technical information, and I wouldn't be surprised if you weren't. But the actual operations for getting on the moon ran through a strategy which required the whole spacecraft to be controlled from a height of, as you see here in English money, initially starting out at 50,000 feet, and then coming down rather like the approach path of an airliner across what will be about 300 kilometers, as you see there. So from just 50,000 feet and across what is essentially 300 kilometers down to the touchdown point, only finally coming down vertically. And it's that's very often led to misinterpretation that you simply just go straight down to the moon. You don't. You fly down and then convert, and gradually, with just a few hundred meters above the surface, operating the thrust rather like a Harrier jump jet when they were flying, to just come down gradually and land at a pre-designated spot with the various safety and uncertainty ellipses that you see there. And again, forgive me, but we are running out of time, and I want to give you an opportunity to give some thought to questions, perhaps. And this just lists the various strategies and the various things that we required. Again, that just shows the various computer programs to the final phase, program 63, 64, and 66. And that just gives you a very, very good indication there of the final reselection for touchdown into a vertical mode. And this took a lot of planning indeed, and the braking phase involving the lunar module. I think I probably thought I had you here for a weekend. I'm embarrassed by the amount of indigestible information I'm trying to depict. That just shows the landing radar, which had 2 positions depending on the pitch. They came with their heads looking up, and then as they pitched forward, the view came up, and so the radar was constantly tracking various aspects down onto the ground. And still there's more various braking phase options. You get an impression of the sheer complexity of every single elemental component of the flight itself. And final approach phase. These are some of the drawings that were modified or used by engineers who modified various components of the actual descent itself. Yeah, it did need a weekend, didn't it? Yeah. How are you fixed for Friday? Feel free to go on to 22. Right, it's going to take that, don't worry. Yes, thank you. The landing point designator, this was the scribed markings on the window, which was in front of Neil Armstrong's window. The mission assignments were, Buzz Aldrin was the systems engineer. He was the flight engineer. He was looking down constantly at the radar readouts and talking to Buzz to Neil to his left, who was eyes fixed on the landing point designator, which you see there, which as the vehicle pitched forward and the surface came up from below as you pitch forward, so the actual designator point would, on these reso markings here, would show the exact point where the computer was taking them down. So he would be able to match where the computer was targeting them, and this is getting down quite low, just a few thousand feet above the surface, a few hundred feet. He would know whether he had to redesignate, because now you are dropping below the threshold at which we've been able to discriminate between very big boulders and really giant boulders. So none of the photography that we had showed anything that was smaller than a house. Well, landing on a house in a lunar module is not going to be the best thing to do for your day. And so the problem was overcome by deferring decision to the pilot in the left area of the lunar module in order to make those readjustments, literally to fly like a jump jet and to move as a Harrier pilot. Those of you who can remember that vertical takeoff aircraft, adjusting the landing spot to touchdown exactly in the same way. So the thrust to hold it off and not crashing was the descent engine, and then the attitude control, pitching forward or not, is much like a helicopter where you move your pitch in order to alter your designated point. So that's what the landing point designator is, and we needn't stay to, and that's the computed position, actual position. Now this just shows here how the landing designations occurred, and the final landing phase. There's lots of this, isn't there? Yeah, didn't know I had this. But, and this just shows the positions. This is interesting here, how we might add. This is descent orbit insertion. That's where the lunar module goes down. This is the relative position of the command and service module, positions ahead and behind the mothership, or above or below. Well, this is dropping down from an altitude of about 80 kilometers down to an altitude of, as I say, 50,000 feet here, and that's speeding up. So as the power descent initiation, it is in fact, what's that, 120, it's about less than 200 kilometers in front of the mothership. As it slows, it falls behind. So this establishes the command and service module, and that's at the fixed point in space. And so at touchdown, it's about 350 kilometers behind the command and service module. That distance can only get wider very quickly, which is why we needed T1 and T2 in order to make very quick decisions whether to get off fast. Do you remember I mentioned immediately after landing, you go through all the systems checks and then determine whether they were T1 or T2. It took 2 hours for the mothership to go straight around the moon. And really, there's only one opportunity, ideally, for every circumnavigation of the moon by the mothership where the LEM could take off and nominally rendezvous. If it was an emergency, they'd just have got off anyway and then sorted out the different rendezvous maneuvers. But that's why this was very, very specific, and why there was a very specific point on that. And that shows admirably there the distance to actually landing down on the surface. For the J series, we came in higher. You can see here that in order to come down over very high mountains, you delayed the time when you reached a point where you throttled back. That's just to show that we could drop down over very high mountains rather than come down on this gentle slope over big basaltic plains, such as that which characterized 11, 12, and 14. Here we are. That's That's just to show you the various sunrise angles. Another thing, the launch window, and here you're looking at launch dates, and what this is talking to, that's the sun elevation angle. Now, you design the whole lunar module so that the sun coming from behind, because you were going down sun, would not come up so high that you'd exceed the temperatures in the lunar module that the sun's radiation would impose upon the structure. So you didn't want to go too high. And also, in landing, you needed, because it was an airless body, the black... You know what it's like driving at night when there's a lot of rain puddles about? You get the reflection of the light off the puddle. You don't know if that's a real serious pothole or if it's just a thin, shallow puddle. Well, in an airless moon, black is black and shadow is black, and light is dazzlingly reflecting. So you have to have the compromise between the two. So a sun angle, pitch angle of 10 to 14 degrees was the best for discriminating between the undulations on the surface, for working out whether you were heading for a deep crater or merely just a very shallow elevation. So that was worked out in the design of the lunar module as to the amount of back protection you'd need for thermal emissivity for the cooling system. So the higher the sun rose, one of the things we worked out as we extended their stay on the surface was that sun angle was going to get higher and higher and higher. Could the insulation of the thermal control system handle the amount of extra heat coming in? So all these factors box you actually into very few launch windows every year for a given launch site. Okay, the data zone, at what angle would it tip over? Well, that's the chart which I have never seen reproduced anywhere in a published piece of material. I've produced it in some of the books I've written. Apart from, I should just say, please don't interpret this as self-publicity, but I've written about 110 books, and I've written a lot in this series, about 16 in this series, about all space equipment, hardware, engineering, science. They're Haynes manuals, those, but I also have a lot of other books as well which go into the technology. So if you want to get into this stuff, I did one on moon missions, which is all the missions after Apollo 11, the 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And I have that chart, which I published in that book. So, you know, if you want to continue this, there's a lot of good stuff out there, but I can point you specifically for these kind of things, because there are very few books that really zero in on the engineering. And that's what these Haynes manuals do. So they give people like me a tremendous platform for telling these stories and for explaining and publishing, because as my wife will groan in a moment, I have 50 filing cabinets of primary source material gathered up over a lifetime with the space program, which informs all of this stuff that I publish. So communicating and talking to folks like yourselves with an obvious interest, whether it's short-term or long-term, is very important for getting the message out about how these systems were engineered and how they were developed. So the pitch angle there is really about 40 degrees, as you'll see by the hard black line right there. And beyond that point, we would not have been able to have had the crew lift off, and they would never have left the moon. So that's why targeting and getting on an approximately level surface was very, very important indeed. Returning to the moon by 2024. So I come to the end of this. I'm going to play you a little video right in a second. As you may know, NASA was developing the Space Launch System, a launch rocket which is bigger than a Saturn V, to send an Orion spacecraft, which is an Apollo lookalike, because you know, why, if the wheel's been invented, why do it again? So we're copying a lot of the Apollo technology now. And President Trump has given the hurry up to that. I completely disapprove of that hurry up, because although we went to a challenging 8-year goal for getting on the moon, it was a very different level of expenditure, as you've seen. We were 2.5% of the budget then. We're 0.4% of it now. We don't have the resources to be able to apply this in, nor should we. There are many, many other competing and vital interests on this Earth, all the way from healthcare and welfare systems right through to environmental issues. We have to put this in proportion. I think the return it makes is valuable, so I support the space program and the Human Space Initiative, because we need to establish a set of bases on the moon. And this is the program called Artemis. Artemis was actually in mythology, was the sister of Apollo, and the boast is that we're sending the next man and the first woman to the surface of the moon on the next time we go back to land. NASA's base plan up to about 18 months ago was 2028. But Trump wants it in time for his second, is he going to get one? Term of office. And so that's what the president wants, and there is some support in Congress for it, but I think it's don't hold your breath. I think the Artemis program is essentially the combination of the Space Launch System, the Iran program, which will go into moon orbit, and then the lander system, which will go down. And this is the trajectory for the Artemis 1 mission, which is a rectilinear halo orbit, which means that it's going to go very, very far out on the far side of the moon on its distant retrograde orbit in order to test. So the basic function is we want the SLS in Iran flying unmanned, uncrewed by the end of next year. It probably will be 2021. To have the second SLS, Artemis 2, flying in 2022, 2023 around the moon, by which time the lander will be developed, and Artemis 3 in 2024 will be the landing on the moon, with the next man and the first woman. And that's a pledge NASA has made, because not only is it international, we're just about on 50% of the workforce female, but also the fact that we have now a contingent of women astronauts who have been robustly contributing to the program, as inevitably they would and should have done a lot earlier, right through the shuttle era, but were absented from the Apollo program, and now their day has come, and rightly so. So I think my very next little clip is about 2 minutes, a real PR hype for what NASA is today.
Ignition sequence start. All engines are up.
We have taken tremendous steps.
We choose to go to the moon before this decade is out.
We have achieved the earth-shaking, the breathtaking, the groundbreaking, and left a mark in the heavens. Our successes build one upon another and amplify what is possible. It's time we take the next great leap. We're building the next chapter of American exploration, returning to the moon to stay, so we can go beyond to Mars, to expand what's possible and further our understanding. The architecture for these missions is already taking shape. We will go with new systems, bold designs, and a sustainable mission. You can hear it, taste it, touch it. We are going. We are training, testing, pressing our pioneering spirit into every component, defining our resolve with every line of code, and securing our success with every welcomed partnership. This is not hypothetical. This is not about flags and footprints. This is about sustainable science and feeding forward the advance of the human spirit. Because we are the pioneers, the star sailors, the thinkers, the visionaries, the doers. And because we stand on the shoulders of giants to go farther than humanity has ever been, we will add our names to the rolls of the greatest adventurers in history. Every day, every mission, we advance this calling. We are NASA. And after 60 years, we're just getting started.
Thank you very much. I know it's a bit cheesy, but hey. Okay. Okay, ready for questions.
Okay, right.
Okay, Ben, if you...
So now we're going to open up the floor. If anyone's got questions, I'm going to be on this side, Ed's going to be on that side. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask David? Any point, anything that you got lost on? Yeah, Ed, you've got behind you.
Okay, so this is probably very good. Thank you very much. This
Welcome.
is almost inspiring. I That's okay. Actually, I want to ask more about the Russia and China collaborations.
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to be evolving in the future years?
Well, Russia became a partner in the International Space Station, along with the European Space Agency, Canada, and NASA, of course. So it was very international, with the Russians very involved from the early 1990s. It was President Bill Clinton who extended a hand of opportunity to the Russians and said, you know, let's work closer. And they, with their economic problems, it was the go-to answer for them. More recently, the political, purely political fracturing between that relationship has not entered the space program at all. We're getting on very, very well with working the Russian program. The Russians have been keeping the space station going since 2011 because NASA has not had a means of getting back there since then, except by launching on Russian rockets. So they continue to carry everybody who goes to the ISS since 2011 when we retired the shuttle. NASA is working with SpaceX to have Crew Dragon and also with Orbital Sciences to have their logistical cargo freighter. So it's a big, big Russian component. We would not have been going for 8 years since the shuttle to space station if it hadn't been for that. There are political divisions between cooperation between America and Russia at a very, very much higher level than the space program. And that is tending to force the Russians toward the Chinese. And I think, unfortunately, because America's not on good terms with the Chinese either. Oh dear, this is getting serious. You know, the Chinese have always wanted to become part of the space station, and NASA has sometimes acted right out of its remit, and the NASA administrator, Bolden, under Obama, because we have Jim Bridenstine now under Trump, because it's a presidential appointee, he went to China he paid for himself to go to China as the boss of NASA when Congress forbade him to use public money just to go and talk to the Chinese. Read into that what you like. We live in a very international world. We live in a global village. And so I deplore the fact that we don't go and talk to people, because that's the problem today. Our politicians ride around in bulletproof cars, and they can't even step outside to talk to each other, but hurl obscenities at each other. So yeah, that gets pretty personal, because I've worked extensively lots of time in my life in the 1980s to bring other countries into these international programs, and now we see a lot of it being undone. So that's bad news, really, but we need to talk to our politicians, start stamping your feet. You know, this is a democracy, folks. You know, and the European Space Agency is very keen to work with China. It's only this administration in America which is really creating problems. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. Does anyone else have a question? Anyone else want to ask something? No, we all understood everything that went on.
Oh, there's one gentleman up the back there, and yeah.
Yep, down the front here.
The Apollo program to me seems an incredible achievement in project management. And I was wondering how much project management methodology spawned out of that, because it does benchmark, it seems to me.
Yeah.
It's an incredible feat. I work at project myself.
Right.
Seeing what was done in such a short
Right.
space of time,
Yeah.
I still think to myself now,
Yeah.
you know, quite an achievement. How on earth did that?
Yeah.
How on earth
Yeah.
did that get managed
Yeah.
at such an extraordinary level?
Really an enabling question for how all this happened. It was a stuttering start under the old NACA people until the Air Force guys moved in and showed us how to do it, and that's really just before I came on board. But project management was vital, and it took in a lot of programs from the Polaris Missile Program, PERT, Program Evaluation Review Technique, which has been succeeded by more advanced concepts. Von Braun was using waterfall charts before then, and so a whole different structure moved in. The real answer is that after the Apollo mission, people like me will go out and give talks about Apollo project management and how the lessons were used in urban planning, in developing continental and international transportation systems, for hydroelectric schemes, for the Alaska oil pipeline project, Oops, that's not very environmentally friendly. But all of these giant projects use some component of Apollo program management techniques. And it's something which I'm very concerned about and like to discuss with companies and organizations, because the models there are profound, even though the methods have evolved and adapted to the different technologies which exist now and the protocols for the way things are done. But you've hit your finger on the very enabling thing that made all this happen. Yeah.
Hi, question about, what do you reckon the effect of private industry in space exploration in the future? How much do you think it's going to become more of a big thing in the future, particularly SpaceX and their big plans to get to Mars and Star?
Yeah. Well, I think on the PR side for SpaceX, I don't think they're going anywhere beyond the moon anytime soon, because there are huge problems which have been identified, not least with the biophysical problems. NASA has the largest database on the human body of any organization anywhere on Earth. It's feeding a huge amount of material to hospitals and to medical centers around the world for the aging process that happens when astronauts go into space. They lose their immune system, they lose a third of their skeletal bone, and bone demineralization is a very serious problem. All of the aspects that happen to us as we get older are mirrored in astronauts spending weeks and months in space. They are putting, even the eyes are changing, the way the brain operates. There are some real serious scares. We've had nobody in space longer than a year, and we're looking at 3-year missions to Mars. It's going to take more than Elon Musk's bank balance to get people to Mars. I think the core question that you're asking is good. We need these as truckers. I see Elon Musk as the Eddie Stobart of the space highways. We call cislunar the movement of goods between Earth and Moon. Cislunar transportation. And when we have a lunar gateway, which is a mini space station around the moon to service our landings and our permanent bases, so that we go and we have Antarctica-style bases on the moon for scientific research, we're going to need to ferry vast quantities of equipment. And what Elon Musk and the other cargo carriers have been doing for the International Space Station, we'll need them to step up to do it for there. So don't believe everything Elon Musk says. He knows he's not going to do this. It's just great PR for him, huge, and he's doing really good work. But so far, all of this stuff with these private contractors has really been subsidized by government money. They're doing it cheaper than governments can in-house. They're doing it cheaper than NASA can. So NASA's paying them to get the hurry up and really do things that NASA doesn't have the breadth now and the sheer mass of inertia to be able to do on its own. So great, we need them, really fantastic. But let's tone down all this. We're going to Mars next year, because it ain't going to happen, folks. Thank you.
Any more questions? I personally have one.
Right.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the fantastic talk today.
Thank you.
So, obviously, you mentioned about all of the innovations that space travel and actually developing these space systems brings into the real world, including the Apollo mission. So, my question is more from 3 different parts. Are there any technologies from Apollo and from the shuttle era that needed to be developed, or you personally can think of that needed to be developed, that have been shelved? That's the first part. The second part is which precautions in a program development, in any engineering venture, which steps do you take to ensure that all of the progress, all of the technical documentation that you have is properly stored and archived, so that everything we've learned from the Apollo era, from the shuttle era, can be reused as quickly as possible? And that would be the second part. And the third part is how quickly can we recompile an engineering solution from that archived information?
Really good questions there. The first one, fuel cells. To me, that just is not yet dawning. We need to batter through. The public need to be informed more. I won't say educated, that's insulting, but they need to be informed much more about these technologies. And we need to make sure that that these kind of logical pathways get through to people to batter on the door of political decision makers and not to go in hock to those who want to leverage their own higher incomes by going through routes which are deplorably anti the very objectives they're trying to achieve. Environmental awareness. Politicians are riding on the back of this. People are desperately concerned. They should be angry. They should be really seriously annoyed at the lack of action because it's going off in the wrong direction. Totally. Don't people know that lithium batteries are made out of material which kids of 8, 9, 10 and 12 who should be in school are being stuffed down mines in Central Africa to develop? We need to develop these countries for the human resources they've got, not as slaves for our eco-environmental halos that we put around ourselves. We are exporting all our rubbish to other countries. We can't export our morals and ethics. But that is the message we must get across, that lithium batteries in these cars are the most toxic substances. They cannot just simply be argued away. So fuel cells, to me, it really gets to me, this, because we've demonstrated in 135 shuttle missions, in all the Gemini flights, in all of the Apollo missions that are hydrogen-based, can do it much more effectively. And we can use hydrogen to replace gas for our heating and for our boilers at a cheaper cost than converting to noisy gas when they had to come around with the little injectors and change all that. Parts 2 and 3 are really the same, I think, Ed. The fact that archiving material, we're in a bit of a problem with the digital age, because I said jokingly, I've got 50 filing cabinets of primary materials. Guess what? It's all paper. It's all in vast, great documents and great plans of all these spacecraft and all these vehicles. Today, when I go around aerospace plants and being involved with them over the last few years, there's intranets within design, for instance, for military combat aircraft, we will say, as well as for spacecraft. Because all the companies are working together as a cohesive group, they digitize this stuff, and then at the next iteration of design, everything else is not even allowed to be preserved. It's burned completely out of the record. So I can no longer take a spacecraft that may be going to Jupiter and use it as an example of how it's evolved in its design, as I can taking Apollo, because I have all the materials. So we are no longer keeping those materials. And the last real question was, how can we replicate what we did before? With huge difficulty. In designing Orion, Lockheed Martin engineers had to go and get Apollo spacecraft out of the National Air and Space Museum to even measure them. You know, I get calls for help for the material I have that doesn't exist anywhere else. So these are real problems, both in the management of projects where you can't have yesterday's design interfering with conduits. You maybe contract out all the plumbing and the lines and the brazing going in various places, when in fact that whole thing is gone. So I can understand why, but it's making it difficult to preserve that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. I think one more round of applause for David. Thank you very much.